Hello, I'm Timothy Radcliffe. I'm a Dominican friar and I'm a Catholic priest. And I could watch the video and it was wonderful. So I hope you'll be catching up with it. I feel immensely honored to share some thoughts with you this evening, but I better start with a confession. When Chris asked me to talk to you this evening, my initial reaction was to say, no, I'm afraid I got no experience of working with refugees in this country at all. But Chris insisted, and so I'll have a go. It reminds me of once I was asked by a Catholic bishop to give a talk on what it means to be a bishop. And I said to my Dominican brothers, but I don't know what to say. I've never been a bishop. And one of my brethren said to me, don't worry, Timothy, ignorance has never stopped you talking in the past. And so it won't tonight. And you can blame Chris. So, all sisters and brothers, sustaining hope with refugees and asylum seekers. I want to focus on the second part, hope. How do we sustain each other in hope as guests and hosts and sisters and brothers? A friend of mine, Sarah Tether, she's the director of the Jesuit Refugee Service. Sarah told me that what gives her hope is the refugees themselves. And I can tell you that's my experience too. After ISIS invaded the northern plains of Iraq, the Nineveh plains of Nineveh, hundreds of thousands of Christians, Muslims, Yazidis fled to Kurdistan. And they included my Dominican brothers and sisters. And I went to visit them in order to give them hope. How arrogant I was. They were the ones who gave me hope. You see, the refugees and asylum seekers who finally make it to our shores mostly have a courage and a resilience which exceed anything that I could imagine. To set out on such a journey, enduring danger, trial, suffering, that expresses a brave hope, which I can only admire. But often it's when they arrive here in our lands that the challenges begin and it becomes difficult to hope. And it's become much tougher recently. The deliberate creation of a hostile environment, destitution often imposed, forced detention, endless waiting, never knowing when it's going to end, forbidden to work, forbidden to study, utter insecurity, and the impossibility of renting accommodation. And now there is a new threat of being sent far away while your claim is being processed. Now, all of this looks as if it's actually designed to make people despair. One of the symptoms of that despair is when time disintegrates. The hope is to live in the present moment, confident of a future. But many refugees and asylum seekers experience the disintegration of time. During this pandemic, we've all experienced that to some extent. When will it end? When will I once again be able to see the people I love and hug them and kiss them? Will we ever be able to have meals together again? Is it really a year since it started? Sometimes it feels like 3 years, sometimes just like 3 months. So time goes all haywire. So imagine the radical dislocation of time for someone seeking sanctuary here. Time drags by and it rushes. Anna Rowland said, Refugees talk about their sense of enforced idleness, the time it takes to get appeals heard, wasting their skills and talents as they endure lengthy time over years rather than months, creating a sense of degrading time, that you lack value, and slowly you lose the skills which are unused. Time falls apart. So how can our sense of time be once again lit up by hope? In the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, hope is discovered in encounter with God and with other people. When there is true encounter, when you really meet somebody, then the present is disclosed in the future. And our lives aren't just one day after another. You know how we remember when we first met the people that we love, and we live in anticipation of the next encounter. Then time becomes hope-filled. But many of our brothers and sisters seeking acceptance here, a welcome, a homeland, have encounters that crush them. Encounters with British bureaucracy that deaden time, rushed meetings, perhaps with inadequate interpreters. No one listens, it seems. Life is going nowhere. Now today, Christians celebrate the ultimate hopeful encounter, the Annunciation. The Archangel Gabriel bursts into the room of the young Mary, not wearing a mask even, ignoring all COVID restrictions, and announces the birth of a child. That's what hope looks like. It's a meeting pregnant with the future. But let us go back to an earlier encounter of Abraham and Sarah with unexpected strangers. You can read it in Genesis chapter 18. So Abraham is sitting at the door of his tent in the midday heat. Time has stopped. Nothing is happening. And in fact, nothing seems to be happening to Abraham and Sarah. The promised child doesn't seem to be on the way. It looks as if it's too late for Sarah. Anyway, she's too old. And then Abraham sees 3 strangers and he welcomes them. And they say to him, Sarah, your wife, will have a child. So once again, time picks up its feet and is filled with hope. How can we relive that encounter with strangers today, particularly the strangers who come to our shores? How do we receive them as bringing good news for us? Notice it begins with Abraham seeing the strangers. Do we really see the people who come to our land? And do we let ourselves be seen by them? Michael Chen, writing about Hispanic refugees in the United States, said that the worst of all things was whether targeted by sexual violence at work, cut off from prenatal care, migrant women are at the same time exploited and invisible. They're seen as sexual objects or cheap labor, but they themselves are invisible. Another friend of mine, an American Dominican, went to a photographic exhibition in Lima in Peru. And he saw there the photograph of a bemused young kid, a street kid. And underneath the photograph, it said, Saben que existo, pero no me ven. They know that I exist, but they don't see me. They know I exist as a statistic, an object, a nuisance. But they don't see me, a fellow human being. When Jesus dined with Simon the Pharisee, a woman, a local woman, probably a prostitute, burst into the room and wept and washed his feet with her tears. And Simon the Pharisee was horrified. Doesn't he see who this awful woman is, this disgusting prostitute? But Jesus says to him, do you see her? Do you see this woman? He said, I entered your house and you gave me no water for my feet, but she has bathed my feet with her tears and dried them with her hair. The Pharisee sees a nuisance. Jesus sees a sister. It all begins with learning to see the human face, the complexity, vulnerability, the humanity that's written all over another person's faith, if only you could see it. I experienced this very powerfully one day in Algeria a few years ago. I've been invited by the local church to come and visit the whole country and think about the future of the church in Algeria. And a Dominican bishop of Oran, one of my brothers, drove me to the side of the country in his small, rather battered old car. Because of civil disturbance, we couldn't fly there. And when we were near the north of the Sahara, we got caught up in the trouble. The car immediately in front of us was captured, and the people were taken hostage. We knew that if we were captured, we might not be taken hostage. It might be the end. And I shall never forget the face of a young man who hung over the car in front of the windscreen with a stone the size of a football. I thought at any moment he could throw it and we would be finished. I tried to catch his eyes, and I thought, if only he can see me, he'd see another human being. He might think of his ancient uncle. And as I looked at his face, I saw that beneath all the hatred, there was fear. This is a young kid. He was probably wondering how he got caught up in this violence. Where would it all lead? And then underneath the fear, I glimpsed for just a moment a young man who his mother loved, whom I could love. I saw my brother. There's a hostel in the red light district in Amsterdam. And one day a prostitute came in looking for some help. And she said to the woman who received her, "Oh, you must be a Christian." And the woman said, "How do you know?" And she said, "Because you looked me in the eyes." For the Jesuit Refugee Service, Sarah tells me that the blessed encounter is often around the table, sharing a meal, human beings with each other, looking at each other face to face, with faces unveiled. And then when Abraham sees the strangers, he runs towards them. He ran from the tent, it says, and met them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourself under the tree. My Lord." How often do we say that to the people who come to us? There's a wonderful Inuit word, and please forgive Forgive my bad pronunciation. I'm not very good at Inuit. Itso arpotik. It means that feeling of excitement when somebody comes to visit you. You're filled with anticipation. You run outside to see whether they've come. Now, Abraham was not expecting them. But when they come, he's filled with excitement, with joy. There must be a feast. Let's party. And he offers them gifts because they are gifts for him. The hope is to see that those who come to us are gifts, and we may be gifts for them too. The first time that I ever went to Iraq was in the time of Saddam Hussein. There was very little to eat because of the sanctions imposed, above all, by Britain and the United States. My Dominican sisters wanted to make me the traditional cake of welcome, but there weren't any ingredients. So they did something very beautiful. They danced the making of the cake. They had nothing to give, so they made a gift out of nothing. Many of the sisters and brothers who have come to our shores have experienced a terrible transformation. They've been transformed into commodities, to be trafficked, to be marketed, perhaps in the slave markets in Libya, or by traffickers charging them to cross the Mediterranean or the Channel to come to us. Human beings are made into objects to be sold, to make money out of them. Think of the 39 Vietnamese refugees who died in a refrigerated truck discovered in an Essex car park. They were registered as biscuits and cookies. It was a sort of anti-Eucharist. Human beings were made into biscuits. Migrants were marketed. And this is the exact opposite of what Jesus did on the night before he died. He'd been sold for 30 shekels. Judas had turned him into a commodity to make money, but he made himself into a gift for us. This is my body given for you. This is my blood poured out for you. If our eyes are open, we'll see that those who come to us are gifts that we should welcome with celebration, like Abraham. One of the ways that we celebrate them as gifts is by acknowledging the skills that they bring, which we need. Nothing is more creative of despair than the denial of the right to do any work while they're waiting. Their human agency is denied. They are made into objects, reduced to passivity. The traffickers have already made them into objects instead of gifts. And often the way that we forbid them to work does the same thing all over again. In Kurdistan, my Dominican brothers and sisters founded refugee centers for people fleeing from Iraq, Christians, Muslims, Yazidis. And these refugee centers were built by the refugees themselves because they were creative, intelligent people. They were engineers, constructors, architects. And we established medical centers for the refugees, which were manned by the refugees, because the refugees were doctors and nurses, people we should delight to have. And one of the gifts that the people coming to our shores bring is their faith. Many of them are Muslims and Christians. This is a gift to our secular society. We must not be afraid. Another profound expression of hope is study. Study is much more than preparing yourself for a job. It forms us as people who try to make sense of who we are and what we're living, our sorrow and our joy. Jonathan Sacks, that great man, former chief rabbi who died recently, he said, human beings are meaning-seeking animals. It belongs to our humanity to try to make sense of our lives through study. Václav Havel, who's a playwright, former president of the Czech Republic, he said, hope is not the conviction that everything will turn out well. It's the hope that it will all make sense, that our sorrows and joys will have some meaning, which we will ultimately discover face to face with God. As St. Paul said, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I shall see fully, even as I am known. Every school is a sign of hope. In the schools run by our sisters in Iraq, Christians and Muslims sit side by side, they become friends, they form dreams together, maybe the dream of a new, tolerant, peace-filled Iraq. I visited the city of Homs in Syria not long ago. In the middle of the desolation of this city, these ruins, I found a school. It was where a Jesuit, Frans van der Lugt, who used to teach there, had been murdered because he refused to leave. And in the school, I found an old Jesuit from Egypt still teaching, a sign of hope in the midst of ruins. Hopes are fertile. And today we remember the meeting of Mary and Gabriel, which led to the birth of Jesus. And we think back to that earlier encounter of Abraham and Sarah with the strangers, leading to the birth of their son Isaac. Fertility. Fertility is the fruit of difference. Difference brings new life, just as every one of us is the fruit of the glorious difference between women and men. Our society tends to be afraid of difference, which is why it's often tempted by despair. On the web, we're in constant communication with people from all over the globe, but because of the algorithms of Facebook and Google, they're usually with people like ourselves, people who belong to our little mental bubbles, our little echo chambers. We flee what Zygmunt Bauman calls risk-ridden complexity into the shelter of uniformity. But when we see those who come to us from afar, from Syria and Iraq and Somalia and Eritrea, from all over the world, when we see them in their wonderful difference, we know that their presence among us will be fertile. They can bring life to tired old Europe, where all the children of immigrants, ultimately, immigration refreshes us and makes us new. But before I conclude, in just a very short moment, we must acknowledge something. That this beautiful reciprocity that many of us can see with strangers, with refugees and asylum seekers, is not seen by everybody. Many of our own citizens in this country are afraid. They feel themselves to be homeless and helpless. All over Europe, we see a rising resistance to strangers, populist movements in every country, a rising xenophobia. In the United Kingdom, 75% of people think that immigration is too high. Pope Francis begs us to build bridges, but all over the place we see walls going up. Christianity means open doors, homes that welcome. But many of the people who resist immigration do not have homes of their own, either literally because they can't afford to buy homes, they can't even afford perhaps to rent them. Increasingly, young people live with their parents because they can't get a home of their own. Often their homes themselves are filled with pain and suffering because of divorce and separation. And if you don't belong, it's hard to welcome others. So let us remember them. Hope is inseparable. So let us seek to sustain the hope of those who seek sanctuary with us from abroad. Let us welcome them. Let us accept their gifts. May they bring us new life, new fertility. But also let us remember those in our own country who feel helpless and homeless. They need hope too. None of us can do everything. Many of you pour out your lives generously in welcoming strangers who come to our shores. You give everything you can to them. All of us, all that any of us can do is get up in the morning, see what there is to do that day and do it. Our small deed may seem not much, but we trust in the Lord of the harvest, who will bring from it fruit that we cannot imagine. But let's forget those other workers in other vineyards who work with people who are suffering from despair, the homeless of our own country, because hope is inseparable. We need hope for all. Thank you very much.